from Jawaharlal University. Sir has published more than 14 books, and he has been writing extensively on various contemporary issues, which are of great topical importance. And sir has guided successfully for about 25 students for PhD. And sir has authored more than 400 articles. Imagine that he is a prolific writer and also a prodigious thinker. He is a reputed international scholar that we, the people of Karnataka and India, can fairly be proud of him. And he is actually a great intellect because he has been influencing so many students by virtue of his teaching, research, and thought-provoking articles and books. He is winning the hearts of thousands and millions of people across the world. And he has got his postdoctoral fellowship even from the Chicago University. Thereby, he has been, now currently he is the Dean Faculty of Arts in the University of Mysore, and he was the Special Officer in Raichur University. He has won, he has got very good awards, including Sahitya Academy Award for his book on Raita Chalavali Mattu Identity Rajakarana in the context of Karnataka. And he has got APJ Abdul Kalam Award also, and Best Citizen Award, and also a Best Teacher Award. He is a much sought after intellect and a very good resource person. Thanks to his visionary thinking, University of Mysore had got an important recognition, that is University of Potential Excellence, and Department of Studies in Political Science had got Center of Potential Excellence. So such a resource is in midst of us. Sir is going to illuminate on important two important topics, namely the idea of India in the first. Shall I continue?
Yeah.
Shall I continue?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And subsequently, sir is going to discuss with you on the one more important and interesting topic, that is multiple identities and India and interface. Both these topics are very much important from the viewpoint of teaching and research. I hope all the teacher participants will be benefited by his brilliant exposition of the ideas. Dear sir, I heartily welcome you online to this particular sessions, and all the teacher participants. Thank you, sir. I give over this session to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Krishna, for probably you are enlightening me also here. I'm so happy about the this refresher course. I think I'm the opening batsman of the refresher course. Let me begin with 2 or 3 propositions. One is that why this idea of India being brought in back to the centrality of the discourses in Indian context. Yeah, meanwhile, I just want to know, do you want me to speak only in English or in Kannada?
There are 56
or 50.
There are participants from different states also, sir.
So in that case, I'll have to be bilingual, or I'll have to stick to English.
Rajasthan, yes. Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, and some other states participants.
Okay. The first question is that my first proposition was that the idea of India was brought in back to the centrality of the political narrative or centrality of the discourses in recent days. Again, there are certain context or the certain issues that are actually bothering India, particularly the intolerance in the Indian context, when the institutions were undergoing severe threats, when the political institutions were, falling prey to the political regimes, when the Indian state has not been able to deliver the required goods to the public at the time of crisis, particularly at the time of the COVID. That time the narrative underwent a series of changes. Or it was in the context of globalization also, when the Indian context, the sovereignty of the Indian state was severely hampered by the intervention of the multinational corporation of the global capital, leading to the death of lakhs of farmers in Indian context. What kind of idea of India should emerge? Most important thing is the basic principles of the or the idea of living together. Basic idea of interactive life. Basic idea of a cultural cultural diversity, or what is called the diverse India, multiple diversity. When they're all undergoing, and they were all facing this, either the crisis, deep-rooted crisis, suddenly they start facing the crisis. The second important, they were also undergoing severe threats, severe challenges. And then the whole issue of India came back to the center stage, knowing that, is it this the idea of India? Even though it started with the Killarney's book of Idea of India, but everybody started looking into that one. There are narratives saying that India has, this idea of India has created multiple India. There are binary oppositions within this India, but at the same time, there are different views. There are different kinds of India emerging. If, for example, like the differences of, the multiple India, I'm trying to say that, look at, you got the India of rich people, India of the poor, India of the backward, India of the forward, India of the global capital, India of the displaced people. In other words, the idea of India is creating this kind of multiplicity, binary oppositions from within. And it was also, and they started asking this question, is it that the idea of India that was created in India in recent years is opposed to, was that the thing, back, or was it that idea of India was, in the back of the mind at the time of the point of arrival, at the time of the independence? What is the great goals of the Indian nation, nationalism? What is the great goal of the biggest nationalist leaders and other things? Was it to demolish India? Was it to divide India? Was it to try to create a homogeneity in Indian cultural practices? These kind of debates that went on. I'll get back to that. What is that kind of, because we need to get into the argument of a couple of leaders who really had their own views about India. Like, for example, how to look at the idea of India, particularly by Nehru, the Gandhi, Ambedkar, M.N. Roy. Take the case of Jawaharlal Nehru, or even take the case of the Phule. How did they look at this India? Did they celebrate India as a country of what's called honey, like the Max Muller would say? Particularly when he was talking about, when you were talking about India, he looked at India as a it's a beautiful country. But before that, let me see, where do you start this idea of India developing? Most of us, we try to say, and we did try to say that idea of India emerged after independence, beginning with the Nehru, Gandhi, and others. But in fact, it's not the case. That I would call it as a myth. Because idea of India was very much in the narratives of the colonialism. Though probably some of the element of the idea of India was very much in the earliest writings. When the conquerors came to India, why they came to India, why Vasco da Gama came to India, why Columbus tried to take a route, tried to come to India. He must have had some kind of notion about India. Otherwise, he would not have come here. Why the Romans they came? Why the Romans had this kind of business or the trade relations with India? Why Alexander tried to conquer India? Why? Simply because he was trying to expand India as such. So look at the very argument. I think India, I'm using the term India here, not the Indies, even though some of the literature would use the word Indi, or very close to that word was the Indica. I think that was the first reference that I would come across. Like, for example, the argument of Megasthenes. His very text was, entitled, or the title of the text was Indica. What does it mean? He was referring to Indica. He was not referring to the Sindhu or Al-Hind. Al-Hind was the word that was literally used during 6th or the 7th century or by the Arabs. But Indica was the first word that I come across. I don't know, there might be some other references. For example, you might say that the Roman empires, they would refer to India as India. No, they never used, but probably there were some words called Indies, which I not come across. But I can authentically say that Indica was the first reference to India. What is it? I mean, what was the thing that Megasthenes talked about India? If some of the things that he talked about was the tribals. He was trying to look at India, then India particularly, between Indus Valley and Bihar to some extent. Try to look at, one of the arguments is that the people of faceless people existing. Probably was referring to what's called a category called the Rakshasas. And he would say that that was a country full of these Rakshasas, faceless people, noseless people. And at the same time, Indica was trying to look at the social system that was existing. He was not referring India. In one side, he was saying that the people were cruel, people were backward, people were completely naked and other things. On the other hand, he was trying to argue about the flexibility in the, we would call it as a caste structure, even though there are debates about that matter. Whether the caste existed during the time of the Megasthenes or the Aryan, who later on wrote about India also, who also came along with Alexander's army. For example, look at the 7. And out of except one category, he came out with the argument of categories like the artisan caste, which somebody said that, no, it's not a caste, it was a class, or the military personnel, or merchant classes, or all these things. In total, sorry. make me meeting me. Yeah. In total, he made 7 divisions within the social system. In one case, which comes very closer to the Brahminical culture, he says that the sophists were nothing but the philosophers. They can become, they can, they can change the professions and other things. So he talks about the rigidity and the flexibility, both the things happening in the case of the social structure. And that's the reason why his idea of India, and there's one more reference too. Probably this reference, we can get it even in the Alteker's book or K.P. Jaiswal's book, particularly with regard to the existence of what is called the Republican form of government. He does make the reference to the Republican form of government in around Indus Valley, Indus River, calling that, he never used the term called the Republican, but he would say that there are certain countries which were not having any kingdom or kings as the rulers. So in other words, he was trying to argue that there was diversity within India in terms of the rigidity and in terms of the practice, in terms of the social existence, in terms of the existence of the, what is it called? I would call them as the Anavarana category, because the Anavarana category comes in even in the Alberini's book. When Alberini wrote in the 10th or 11th, 12th century about India, his idea of India, which is very much clear, was different, completely different. I'll come back to that one a little later, because the idea of India was not a new one. It evolved over the years. It changed with the circumstances. It added the strength to the idea of India. Or take the case of in fact, in Megasthenes, there is no reference to Chanakya's Arthashastra. Chanakya's idea of India was full of small states, and he wanted to create what's called the Vijagishu, conquering state, an imperial force, because that time that was a kind of requirement. So Chanakya's Kautilya Shastra added new dimension to the idea of India, that idea of India has to be a powerful country. Even though we don't come across the word called the India as such, but one can deduce the argument from there. So he wanted to establish a powerful country in Chanakya's Arthashastra. He wanted to have something called the foreign policy. Probably Cholas, they did have this kind of understanding. They wanted to create what's called the naval force. They had a naval force. Their idea of India was to expand. This is the same kind of thing happened in the case of Ashoka. Look at Ashoka's argument. Ashoka wanted to convert India into a peace-loving country. He wanted to spread the religion. And the religion was nothing but a Buddhism, which believed in the coexistence of people, which believed in the peaceful land. And that's the reason why this idea of what's called Dhamma Chakra, the idea of peaceful living, idea of giving up the violence, that all emerged. That was added into the idea of India. So the idea of India was expanding. It is not simply the geographical idea alone. Geographical idea would have been, confined to, the countries of the what's called geographical areas beyond this Indus Valley down to the South India. But it was something else. So if you look at, then you come across the medieval period, particularly beginning of the medieval period. You have one, the best scholar. There are others too, but I would call him as the best scholar, Al-Biruni. There are many also. They try to understand India by visiting different places. For example, in 6th and 7th century, you got many Arab travelers coming down to India, trying to explore the social lives in India. And they try to look at the caste system existing in India, and also try to look at the social life, looking at the different cities, principalities, and to try to exchange. For example, there are certain, in the whole process, they try to what's called the bring the two knowledge system together. For example, algebra kind of thing, scientific knowledge in mathematics and other things, even in the philosophy. So the whole question is that this idea added strength to the idea of India. Look at the Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni, when he wrote his text, India was divided into many principalities. Interestingly, he was the one who read Indian classical text, Aryabhata's text, Sushruta's text. Take the case of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, or even the text on the mathematics, geography, geology, and other Skanda Purana and other things he started reading. And he tried to, if you look at his narratives, initially he tries to compare different states of Central Asia. Then when he came down to India, came down to and see, read, translate many of the works available in India, whether it's a Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, or the text of, not the Kalyana. Kalyana came later on, very, very late, I think the 16th or the 15th century. Or they take the case of the Aryabhata, Sushruta, and also the work about, if I'm right, about two important universities. So he started to posit or started to investigate the knowledge system prevailing in India. That's called the indigenous knowledge system. His major argument of when you're talking about the idea of India is that idea of in India comprised of the large amount of knowledge system. It was not simply geographical area, area alone. It is largely composed of the different philosophical discourses, philosophical narratives, philosophical, contestations. For example, like even though this matter, later on you can find it out in the argument of M.N. Roy, who tried to look at India as a center of discourses, which later on Amartya Sen also talks about it in his book Argumentative Indian. What M.N. Roy and Scuttleway Alperini was trying to argue about was the existence of the multiple philosophical narratives in India. One, that I would call the first knowledge system, knowledge things that he tried to invent, tried to argue about. The second, as a foreigner, but came down to India, Alberini's major argument was to say that the Indian knowledge system is not the uniform or single or homogeneous. It is multiple. It is heterogeneous. It's spread across the different things. The third important aspect of Alberini's was the fact that he compared the Indian knowledge system with the Islamic, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and other things, and tried to find out the specific characteristics of the Indian knowledge system. See, what I'm trying to bring it here is the fact that there are times when there are people who try to denigrate the Indian knowledge system. But unfortunately, when he was talking about the political philosophies, he did not refer to Charvakas, nor he referred to the Shunya philosophies and other things, but he referred to the Indian knowledge mediating through the health issues, or mediating through the geology, and other things. But its contribution is significant, even in the is significant in another sense also. He also identified the social structure existing. Like, for example, when he was referring to the caste system, he did agree with the fact that the idea of India also had the idea of the caste. Even though he says that it was a Brahminical caste. In fact, I don't know, I have not come across the word called the Hindu, social practices or the Hinduism. But definitely he was using the term called the Brahminical social order. He was also narrating the similar kind of argument that was available in the post-Vedic period. 4 castes, 4 functions, functional caste. And interestingly, like was Chanakya who talked about one particular caste which was out of the orbit of this caste system, called the Chandalas. Alberini also talked about what's called the Anavarana category. First time we come across the word called the Anavarana. Anavarana is a category which is out of the realm of these 4 important castes. Particularly after the Shudra category, you have got something called the Anavarana. They are those who are outside the realm of this caste system. They are not without caste, but they are seen as out of the caste system, but a caste. So you have this idea of India growing, adding into the knowledge, adding to the ideas of the social system, adding to the idea of diversity. But at the same time, you got another idea when you talk about the philosophical discourses or the philosophical narratives. How far classical India was too secular, despite the fact that there are conflictual situations between the Buddhism and the Sanatana, religion. The argument was that classical period also gave rise to the multiple discourses, multiple narratives, multiple interactions. And at the same time, there's another kind of argument saying that the classical India also allowed to the growth of, to the presence or, to the existence of political institutions, which became the harbinger of the modern institutions. Look at in the first case, the argument is that you have got multiple philosophical discourses, philosophical narratives, either interacting or contesting or critiquing. For example, you have this philosophical discourse like the Charvakas. You got the philosophical discourse on the Sunya. Other kinds of philosophical discourse also came into existence. They coexisted. They allowed the presence of other. They recognize these kind of philosophical discourses. And that's the reason why you have got this history of coexistence of the philosophical narratives. You have got the existence of interacting philosophical narratives. Like, for example, they also talk about the discourse analysis in the context of Buddhism. Buddhism was seen as a part of Indian culture. The kind of debate that was happening in the case of the Buddhism was nothing but a critique. It was a space. It was, interactive kind of argument. It is developing a dialogue. It was developing a discourse. It was developing a narrative. It is developing what is called the counter arguments. It was also developing what is called the alternative narratives. Take the case of the arguments of the Nagarjuna and with the many monks as a Buddhist scholar and other kinds of things. So what happens that these narratives provided spaces for the dialogue within India. The idea was India was not complete stagnation. Like, for example, there was the colonialists they had, including Marx. They had this kind of notion saying that Indian economy and Indian politics was largely a stagnated politics. It was, like Max Weber would argue, that the idea of India, since it is rested on the idea of caste system, with this rigidity, with this inflexibility, non-flexibility, India would not transform, it will remain as rigid. So it will not develop into a dynamic political system. It will not create dynamic political system. Neither it will be possible to bring a transformation. So they pinpoint the India as a country which remains stagnant politically and philosophically. Even the economic level also, India, remained as a stagnant country for many years. So this is the kind of idea that the Western scholars like the Max Weber had. But before that, we need to get into what was the argument that the colonialists had. But before that one, we need to understand, as I said, that we had the second important issue about the institutional. Whether the idea of India had spaces for the institutional growth. One argument is the Max Weber's argument, which includes the argument of Marx, saying that Indian economy, Indian political thinking was stagnant because of the caste structure. Other hand, we have got the scholars talking about the changing narratives in Indian classical period, where it would allow many kind of dialogues within itself. So idea of India is not stagnant. Idea of India is flexible. It was changing. It was adding new ideas. The new idea is that the idea of interactions. India was nothing but a country of interactions, whether it's between European countries or, for example, like the Roman Empire or with the Arab world, trade relation, or with the Chinese and other things. The second idea is that India was dynamic. India was allowing multiple discourses or the narratives to emerge. And a kind of religion that emerged in Indian context, it was not creating spaces for any kind of rigidity to happen. It was very flexible. It was providing spaces for the democracy. Like this argument was later on also made in the 12th century, when Abhinava Anubhava Mantapa was established by Basavanna. Even though, interestingly, there is an intellectual amnesia here operating. If you read Amartya Sen when he was talking about the argumentative India, because his idea was that India created a important space, created a space for the dialogue, for the discussion, for the narratives, for the critique and other things. He was referring to this Charvaka, Shunya, Buddhism, and other kinds of philosophies. And also he referred to Akbar's Dini Ilahi, where different religions come together and discuss, about the things. But incidentally, I'd call it a paradoxical rather than the incidentally, Amartya Sen never referred to Basavanna's Anubhava Mantapa, 12th century Anubhava Mantapa, as a contribution to the democratic principles. What I'm trying to say is that the idea of India combined all these things. It evolved over the years. It is not the product of the post-colonialism, neither the product of recent years. It is a product of evolution. Or take the case of the idea of institution. Let me refer to the argument of Altekar or K.P. Jaiswal or Bandopadhyaya or Saleto and others. There is a huge number of scholars. They started inventing the political institution of the past. Their invention was not the accidental kind of thing. Their invention was a resistance to the colonial encounter, intellectual encounter. Mainly because you know that colonial encounters would dismiss any kind of contributions, you know, of Indians to the idea of India. So their argument, initial argument, colonialist argument, was basically the argument about the ignorance of India. The second important argument, if you read their literature, for example, even the argument of William Jones and others, that they would argue that nothing was Indian. For example, William Jones, I think in 1833, when he was delivering a lecture, he said that two languages which have been spoken, which have become what is called the state language, Sanskrit and Persian language, they are not Indians. They were from somewhere, basically, he was trying to refer to the Syria. Syria was the almost that, in around the places. They were the original place of Sanskrit and Persian language. This led to the whole theory about the Aryan invasion. India was the country, a country of immigrants, leave alone the Scythians or the Mughals or the Huns and others, but also the Aryan, the original settlers of India were the Aryans. So there was an attempt to demolish, except Max Muller and a couple of, historiographers, colonial historiographers. Even I would say that British tried to be British. What's it? The person name who divided up, West Bengal. They tried to invent India. The others try to argue in terms of the civilization, argue in terms of the what's called the non-modern aspect of the India. They would say that India was, a civilizationally backward country, absolutely civilizationally backward. So the whole argument, whole idea of India was to transfer India from an uncivilization mode to the civilization mode. This is quite apparent if you read the earlier the letters written by the directors of the East India Company to their chief director. And how to transform that to, and I'll come back to that. Macaulay's argument. Idea of India is the creating spaces for the new civilization country. I think it happened in the case of the 1830s when Macaulay, brought a bill saying that we should replace Sanskrit and Persian languages as a state language, as administrative language. Instead, it has to be replaced by the English language. It was not only to, even though there's one catch here. If we read the earlier letters written by the East India, directors and others, you come across one fascinating argument. So argument is about what will happen, why should we implement or introduce English language? In fact, one of the directors who remain anonymous wrote a letter saying that we should not impart English language, English education in India. They thought that by by introducing the English, we can create a baboos. Baboos was nothing but the white collar clerks to man the administration, British administration, without much loss, without much expenses. And that's the reason why in army, if you look at the army, British army, the colonels and others, they were basically British. And the army was basically Indian army. Most of the, personnel way belonged to India, including the judges and others. So they had this one particular argument when the argument about imparting education in India, particularly English language. Argument was that they lost America just because they introduced English. Because by virtue of English, people have become very conscious about the issues of liberty, freedom, and others. Because that exposed them to the idea of liberty, the idea of rights, idea of property rights and fundamental rights and other kinds of rights. Why should we lose India by making them educated? But that argument did not receive much focus in the deliberations. Later on, we have got the Hunter Commission and other. I think it was during the time of Bentinck. Macaulay's argument of introducing English was taken up in 1830. I think so. And that was English became the lingua franca. It became the administrative language. And the whole argument was backed by this argument of the civilization. Indians are basically uncivilized or non-civilized. That's the reason why this was demonstrated through many reports. Like, for example, travelogues, the writings of the missionaries, like the Jesuit fathers. Later on, it was also backed by the argument of the census reports or the gazetteers, and also the police records and other things. They would say that, look, you had the categories called the backward, forest dwellers. You have the category called the animist. You got the category called the what's called the criminal tribes and other things. So this was projected to argue that the Indians were basically uncivilized and barbaric and non-modern. Tribals were, for example, like they were not treated like that. So the colonial idea of India was that it was a country of thousands and thousands of castes, each caste having the subcaste. Each caste is hereditary. Each caste believes in the rigidity. Each caste believes in the hierarchy. And each caste tried to be different from others and would not allow any kind of dialogue with others. It was literally a backward country, one side. It was also a country which was non-modern. But that is another idea. Idea of India was that India was a country of resources. beginning with the Columbus. If you read the Columbus narrative, these 3 volumes, the Great Voyages, these volumes was basically to find a route, sea route to India from European continent to India, but also to conquer India and plunder India also. Given the fact that idea of India was nothing but a country of prosperity, country of, what is it called? The country of resources. And it was not simple the argument about the backwardness alone. Look at, if you read Columbus volumes, definitely you'll get the different kind of idea that he had. Why when the Portuguese or Vasco da Gama came down to Malabar? It's a simple argument. It was the argument about the availability of the spices, availability of the ingredients, availability of the country of the prosperity. For example, let me give one more example of the Nicholas. Nicholas came from Leningrad. Leningrad, he came down to Iran, then he took a Arab name and came down to Vijayanagara. If you look at his argument about the India, he had this notion that in India, one can do the business. India was a prosperous country. But the similar case, others, like for example, Sharia, who was working as a ship in the ship, who came from the Persia during the medieval period, came down to India and documented the existence of the principalities and wrote about it. Or take the case of the Nicholas, take the case of the Ibn Battuta. They're all from foreign country. But even in India, the colonialists also appointed people like Buchanan, who traveled from Madras to Malabar one side, I think from the West Bengal to the eastern part of the UP, who documented each and every aspect of India, whether the diversity, like the natural diversity, like the river, flora and fauna, water resources, temples, and palaces and other things. He had this wide understanding about, he had the understanding that there's diversity in India. What I'm trying to say that, look at this argument of the diversity, tolerance, coexistence, interactions, they evolved over the years. Or take the case of political institutions, which I was referring to. KP Jaiswal and others, they've been talking about the existence of the political institution called the Republican form of government. Guru Panchala, for example, was one of the Republican form of government that existed. And there are Republican form of government like what's called the Aida Upajivini, Republican form of government. Instrument, arms became, as a Upakasabu. And there are institutions like the Sabha, Samiti, and Videha. They are the political institutions. Videha was the tribal institution. Sabha was the popular institution. Samiti was the institution of the caste. And these institutions believed in the democratic principles. They had what is called the pakshas. One of the pakshas was identified as the Krishna Paksha or Shukla Paksha, even though one can debate about that. What I'm trying to say that, look at, you have got these institutions evolving over the years. So the idea of India evolved. And at the same time, you have got the colonialists. One side, they had the very condemnation. They discarded, like, for example, the argument of Macaulay. What is the argument of Macaulay with regard to the knowledge system prevailing in India? Macaulay said, all the knowledges of India would be sufficient to be kept in one shelf of the book rack in the European countries. That's all the knowledge system that existed according to Macaulay. He was trying to denigrate the Indian knowledge system. He was trying to defame the Indian knowledge system. But look at the kind of argument earlier Alberuni made, who appreciated the existence of the knowledge system, differences in the knowledge system. He not only appreciated, but also documented that knowledge system. Colonialism had, I would say, that contradictory argument. One side, they negated. In idea of India, it's a backward, uncivilized, and other things. On the contrary, people like Max Weber, who created a kind of institution to understand Indian philosophy. For example, Manu Dharma Shastra, he translated. In fact, his assistant who translated Manu Dharma Shastra and other things. But he called, particularly when he was delivering lectures, series of lectures to the Indian IAS aspirants, then ICS aspirants, that India was an exotic country, a beautiful country, absolutely beautiful country. And this was narrated by other colonialists also. And that's the reason why they tried to invent the knowledge system. What idea of India was completely barren. They were trying to invent Indian knowledge system, saying that Indian could, did have this kind of, large amount of knowledge system. Look at, it all began with the translation of the Indian classical text, 1830s and post-1830s. They began to understand that there are many things in India. And then they started digging, what's called the excavate archaeological sites, which later on became the site of national pride. Like, for example, one site which brought this national pride was the Indus Valley civilization. Indus Valley, what's called archaeological site, which brought to the focus that we had advanced urban system, city system. We had advanced governance, which was on par with any other civilization as such. So you got this argument, and at the same time, the argument of preserving our arts, heritage, buildings, which is trying to give an idea of India. For example, this excavation gave rise to the idea that Samudragupta's period was golden age. It also gave rise to the argument that Ashoka was, whose earlier name was, what's called Priyamvada. I think the Priyamvada. And also, he, initiated the spreading of the Buddhism to the different world. And his idea of peaceful existence was the norm of the early, later, ancient period. So it gives the ideas, many ideas about India. It provided the argument of the political institutions. It provided the argument about the multiple philosophical discourses, philosophical narratives. It gave rise to the idea of secularism, because Buddhism and Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma coexisted, even though both were mutually antagonistic. Or Jainism, it also provided. So you got the mutual tolerance emerging. Or take the case of the syncretism. It also gave rise to the idea that India was a country of syncretism, a bhakti movement. Syncretism is that it brought different cultural practices to India. It amalgamated with the Indian cultural settings and gave rise to a new social setup. It's called the idea of syncretism, the idea of coexistence. So look at, and also this idea also gave rise to participation of the masses in the political institutions. Even though it was post 1910, 1920 onwards, when the people started entering into the nationalist movement. But it gave the clue that the masses were participating in the political process, which was quite apparent in the Sabha and Samiti and other things. So whole set of arguments were made. India was a country of the diversity. India is a country of the mutual tolerance. India is a country of the secular practices. India is a country of openness. India is a country of interactions. India is a country of traversing its own path. India is a country of some of the democratic institutions. So idea of India of this kind of thing evolved over the years. So it's not a post-independence contribution, even though Khilnani argues that the idea of India, it has got many things. Like, for example, the idea of India is today largely tolerance. And say that it's not only tolerance, but also it's the idea of India was derived from the arguments Gandhi, Nehru, or idea of India was derived from Ambedkar and others, large number of other scholars. Even though Nehru Gandhi was strong enough to advocate the idea of India, who talked about liberalism, who talked about the secularism, who talked about the principles, who talked about the representation, who talked about constructing India in terms of the modernity or building huge, new, what's called the, what's called buildings, or starting the irrigation projects and other things. But in fact, and that's the reason why when he constructed Bakra Nangal Dam, he called it Bakra Nangal Dam as the temple of modern India, because it demanded a modern outlook. So idea of India lies in the idea of modern notion of development. The idea of India, it was nothing but a secular idea. Okay. All these kinds of arguments that are being made. It is a plural India. where everybody coexists, where everybody talks about you know everybody is interacting with each other without any kind of hatred. Idea of India is about decentralization also, where the power is not concentrated. More than that, idea of India is basically about democracy, where people participate without prejudice, without caste affiliations and other things. So it got the modern idea of, idea of India of post-independence period, even though this idea of India is derived from the or medieval or the modern period or classical period. Was there any dent in the idea of India? The whole argument is that there are two kinds of argument. One is that the ideological competition led to the conflictual situation that has ultimately transformed, that has affected the functioning of the Indian democracy. And the idea of democracy, idea of India is slowly collapsing, where tolerance, coexistence, mutual respect, harmony, syncretism, all these things are collapsing. That's one kind of argument. Second argument is that given the long history of Indian democracy, Indian secularism, Indian liberalism, Indian republicanism and other things, idea of India will not completely collapse. It's not so easy to collapse. It's not so easy to demolish it. It is not so easy to destroy it. So idea of India is now in the midst of two competing situations. One is the collapse, one is the sustaining. And it is this catchy situation wherein everybody has become either part or either become what's called a critique of both the position, or they are trying to say that idea of India should exist in India forever. And at the same time, the argument, it holds good, saying that you cannot kill the idea of India, given the fact that idea of India is not rested in one particular idea alone. Remember, idea of India lies in multiple ideas of India. Everyone has got his own ideas. For example, take the case of the peasantry. Take the case of the Dalits. That's the reason Ambedkar becomes the most important. Their idea of India is to have the equality, social equality. Or take the case of the Gandhians. Their idea of India is the idea of principled India, with Ahimsa as a added strength. Or take the case of the Nehruan idea. The Nehruan idea is the idea of modern India, with industrialization, and also referring back to the ancient period, Indian social history and the social culture, cultural history and other things. And you've got other ideas also, other people also pitching in. But my hunch is that, but the last issue is that this idea has to sustain. This idea of India has to live, it should be, everlasting, solution, and particularly the idea of sustaining, idea of peace, idea of tolerance and other things which we borrowed from the history, historical narratives and other things, that needs to have the continuity. In the moment this idea of India collapses, then obviously categories will collapse, community lives will collapse, and the very identity of ours will collapse. I think the whole question is that how to reclaim shrinking spaces for the idea of India. Sorry, I don't have any answer for that, but one can say, I can say that idea of India needs to be protected, needs to be defended, needs to be highlighted, and needs to be reclaimed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Hello.
प्रश्न के लिए okay, we will come back after half an hour, after 45 minutes, or sorry, 3:30 or 3:45.
3:45, sir.
Okay.
There is no any discussion session. Yes, sir.
I don't think so.
We have.
ತಪ್ಪಡಿಲ್ಲ.